All right, my friends, let's get going. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, and I am ready to go if you are. We're talking about movies today, a subject that's come up a few times on this show, obviously an obsession of mine, and I'm not unique in that. But lately, as I get older, honestly, it's the 90s movies that are obsessing me. I watch the stuff, whether it be Hollywood or indie movies from that era, over and over again. I confess it's my own nostalgia trap. I'm just caught watching the stuff that I watched when I was young. But I also think there's something to this era beyond just the nostalgia. It was a really rich era for movies, kind of a renaissance in some way or another, almost like the 70s, honestly. And my guests today have a lot to say about that. Their names are Aaron and Carlee. They are the hosts of a podcast called Hit Factory that you should be listening to if you listen to this program, because they are talking about a different 90s movie every episode. I'm so jealous of so many of the movies they've talked about already. Talented Mr. Ripley, so many others. The Hunt for Red October, Bringing Out the Dead, The Fugitive, Pretty Woman. All of these movies just dominate my imagination. So it was really fun to have them on the program. We are talking about a very specific, gigantic 90s movie today. And that movie is called Natural Born Killers. Came out in 1994, directed by Oliver Stone, starring Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis. We talk a lot about this movie, so I won't say too much up front, other than to say that I experienced this movie very profoundly when I was young. It came out when I was like in high school, and it was a big event. It was like a huge controversial thing for those that don't remember. And the movie, watching it now, so many years later, almost 30 years later, honestly, and I'm a different guy and it's a different era. It was a mind fuck watching this movie, and my feelings about it are probably as chaotic as the movie itself. I really don't know if I think this is a total masterpiece or a total piece of shit. And it was really fun to work this out with Aaron and Carlee, who have great takes on all this stuff too. So go check out Hit Factory. Please enjoy this conversation about Natural Born Killers, and go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon. We've got a lot going on this week, including a new episode of Gender Trap, in which we're talking to Yasmin Nair about housing markets in New York City, class and gender. That was a really fun conversation. You can check all that stuff out at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap and enjoy this conversation with the Hit Factory folks talking about Natural Born Killers. All right, on the slate today, we're talking about the 1994 Oliver Stone film, Natural Born Killers. Aaron and Carlee, how's it going?
It's going. What an experience that film is.
Yeah, very excited to talk
I'm
this
still reeling, by the way.
It's a sick, twisted roller coaster ride into the American nightmare. That's I feel like some critic must have described it that way, right?
100%.
I watched a Charlie Rose interview, in fact, where I think he does exactly that.
Really?
Yeah, and I don't remember her name now, but there's a writer, critic, someone who was Oliver Stone's ex-wife, and Charlie Rose read her take on the movie live to him, where she's like, on a stylistic level, I find it brilliant. Oliver is a remarkable filmmaker, but as a film, I detest this movie. I absolutely hate it and everything it stands for. ... It was a lot of fun.
That's intense to read a scathing review from the guy's ex-wife, just right to his face on television.
He's like, Brenda, we could have had a conversation about this.
Well, Charlie Rose, for all the man's problems, and they are many, he was certainly not a apprehensive interviewer,
No, I love the Charlie Rose interviews. I mean, I'm sad he got canceled, but that's his fault, right?
Yeah. Oh, we'll have a conversation about cancellation, I think, as it relates to this movie.
Oh, yeah, right?
There's some germane... there's some territory there that I feel like applies to movies people are talking about online today and the response to this film, but we can save that.
I wonder if we could maybe start with our personal, our personal sort of experiences with this movie. I mean, how many times have you guys seen this movie, etc.? I would love to know. Did you see it at a young age and it scarred you?
Carlee's got a good story actually.
It's not a good story. It involves weed and feeling stressed out watching a film. That's like a thing that most people experience. No, I've only seen this movie twice. The first time I saw it, I was in college. I got stoned, and I don't know whose decision it was to put this movie on. It wasn't mine. It was definitely not mine. And yeah, like it was a stressful experience being high and watching this film, obviously. But I think what made it stressful was not like, oh, like the weed was making me paranoid, but it was more that like there's so much to take in about the movie that like my mind was not able to process all that was going on. So I was just experiencing like 2 hours of overwhelm, rather than like, sort of like acute fear. There were several moments though wherein I found myself like actually sweating because I was like very undone by what I was seeing on screen. But that was the last time I saw it, and that was many years ago. And it was really interesting coming back to this movie sober, and amid a context, a background context of a conversation that hasn't really changed since the movie came out, has sort of morphed a little bit. But this idea of like the purity of images and like how images can corrupt, and like I think I was not ripe for that kind of conversation or consideration in college. And so I appreciated like that clarity sort of informing my viewing on this most recent watch.
That makes total sense to me. I mean, it is constructed as a media overload type movie that would just completely saturate you and overwhelm the stoned mind. I mean, there are panic attack movies for sure, and like, yeah, even beyond just the content, which like, I mean, watching it this time, it didn't even seem like that violent a movie to me, honestly, compared to a lot of stuff I've seen.
Yeah,
but it's just the like non-stop MTV aesthetic of just canted camera angles and black and white and color and black and white and color, and now we're doing like little fast edits with Woody Harrelson all bloody and little satanic horror movie snippets. It's a little much.
It's a lot.
How about
you,
Aaron?
For like a 19-year-old stoned mind to be like, sure, I guess we're watching this.
Yeah. And on my end of things, this is actually the first time I've seen this movie in full. I've seen snippets of it. I briefly tried to watch it one time. I feel like in high school on YouTube, there was like a really, really bad, like low quality rip of it. Actually, my familiarity with it and my initial intrigue with the film was actually sparked by like an internet rabbit hole about Columbine. Like I grew up in the 90s. I remember it being a huge media event. I remember it being very scary for my parents and for a lot of people in like, suburban communities and when that was happening. And for whatever reason, and it wasn't anything like, I found something resonant in their messages or anything. I just found the idea of and the ideology behind like mass shooting, and specifically like these kids who decided I'm gonna go to a school and kill people, like I found that fascinating is kind of a nasty word for it, but that is what it was. It was sort of like this fascination with this fixation on like what that is. So started like watching like documentaries on it and reading about it. I watched like Bowling for Columbine at the point too. And everywhere I went, it was MBK, right? Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris called their sort of plan NBK for natural born killers. And so that was my initial, like, I guess, journey to it where I was like, oh, okay, like so this movie is the thing that got these guys to kill people. And I didn't think of it in that sense. Like I was never someone who was like, oh, movies are brainwashing. Because I was a cinephile from like a young age too. I was never like, this doesn't compute to me. I don't understand, and I don't buy this relationship one to one with like violent media and real life violence. But I did find the connection fascinating, and that to find that the movie was actually a satire of the very thing that I feel like Klebold and Harris kind of warped and misinterpreted in their mind, is all the more interesting, especially after watching it in full this time.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'm an old corn cob, so I was actually in high school when this movie came out, and 1994 was like, I think it's like the year I came online as like loving Hollywood movies. It's the year that like Forrest Gump came out. You guys just did The Fugitive. I was like a huge Fugitive guy. I mean, I was like 15 years old, but like Natural Born Killers was a new edge, and it was part of, I mean, I guess we'll talk about Tarantino at some point, but that name, Tarantino, was like all over the place in 94 because Pulp Fiction was coming out, and it was like making a big splash at all the film festivals, and it felt like cool and subversive and punk, and like there was some charge to Natural Born Killers, knowing that Tarantino had written the story, and Oliver Stone was just coming off like JFK and like all these like huge successful movies, and a whole like 80s of like making movies about the Vietnam War that were supposed to be like the hardcore. So it was like, I don't know, there was some hardcore edge to it. And yeah, Columbine had not happened when it came out. So I was just I had a Natural Born Killers t-shirt, which now like I wish I had it because it's like such an artifact, but it was the t-shirt was like, the animated sequences where like they're like really like gonzo versions of themselves. It was it was a t-shirt with like Woody Harrelson on it, like basically like shooting a woman into pieces. And now I'm thinking about like, what the fuck was I doing wearing this as like a 16-year-old kid? I don't know. That conversation about media and violence was so dominant. I remember at this time, like in school, we were writing essays about media violence and what it means to live in a world where media is super violent. And the word that I know the conversation is the same in some ways, but the word that I don't hear anymore is desensitization. Everyone used that word. They said, we're becoming desensitized. And Natural Born Killers seem like almost like a troll at that whole idea.
Yes. I'm so glad you brought up the piece about desensitization, because I think therein lies the way that the conversation has morphed today, is that the demands for sort of like the purity of images are, I think, a response to a hypersensitivity to like violence or perceived violence, but sort of only on the plane of media and media consumption, not necessarily like, a hypersensitivity to say like the violence of our police state, right? Like that's where I find the breakdown to be illuminating and troubling in terms of today's discourse. But yeah, I mean, I was old enough in the 90s. I didn't see this movie when it came out. I didn't see it till I was in college, which is some years later. But I do remember the conversations about particularly video games and violence. Like parents were really obsessed with the idea that like video games were like corrupting children's minds. And of course, like, the ratings for films and the way that those were sort of policed when it comes to kids, and music too. Like the conversation around Marilyn Manson as it relates to the Columbine kids, I think is another important one. And all of this kind of signaling a broader, like, critical posture towards media, and not necessarily the acknowledgement of the structural forces informing a violent society, or like a propensity towards violence. Capitalism is built on violence. It's built on exploitation and oppression. And so it's interesting that there have been all these ways, you know, in neoliberalism, within the landscape of neoliberalism, that we have tried to sort of narrow the scope of what is causing the problem. And those arguments to me just end up falling really flat. And what I love about this film that I think I've come to realize watching it now in 2022, much older than when I last watched it, is I think not only is Stone saying fuck you and your like revulsion towards violent images in media, because he's showing us all of the different ways that we consume those things that aren't considered problematic, like news and whatever else, right? But I think he's also saying, like, these people aren't natural born killers. Like, they were created this way. Like, they were turned into this by society. And that's not to say that they were turned into this because they watched a scary movie. I think he points the finger at a lot of other institutions in the film that are implicated in their violence.
Yeah, I agree. It's a wide net, right? Like, there's a lot going on in this movie.
Yeah, it's like a frenzied is the only word I can think of to describe it. And he seems almost as like confused as anyone else in the movie about the kind of movie he's making. Yeah, like there's indictments here of media, there's indictments here of law enforcement, there's indictments here of like you know, the myth of the nuclear family, all of these kinds of things happening. There's systems and cycles of abuse happening here, and you know,
the Rodney Dangerfield shit is some of the nastiest shit, I swear to God.
Yes,
it's psychotic, but it's also really, really like kind of brilliantly handled.
It's the most to me, it's the most memorable part of the movie is the like sitcom abusive father scene. That's pretty early in the movie.
Yes,
that just lacerated me when I was young. I didn't know what to think of that. Like I think the kind of combination of the sitcom style and the like really rough violence it became kind of cliche after this, but it was so new at that moment that it was pretty shocking.
Yes. I think there's so much about Oliver Stone's style and his like the deftness with which he collages images and different kinds of media that like now is well-tread territory, and there's a consuming audience that kind of recognizes that cinematic language. But at the time, particularly with JFK, and I think also with this movie, like not a thing that we were used to or literate in, and there's so much about what he's doing here that is shocking. But I wanted you to go more on that, because I think the Rodney Dangerfield stuff is really, really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, there's just like a potency there. I read too that I guess Rodney Dangerfield was given permission to like rewrite his entire scene, like all of his characters' dialogue. So he like really juiced it up, and I guess probably made it, you know, flow a little bit more like a punchline. But he was reading these really horrific, awful you know, lines of dialogue.
It sounds like Rodney Dangerfield. It still like sounds like him, even though like, the shit he's saying is so fucking gnarly. Jesus.
Yeah, which makes it even creepier. You know, it's like here's this very sort of like iconic comedic figure saying these really awful, terrible things, and doing so in like a cadence and in a way that feels familiar to us. It adds that extra sort of like textual level of familiarity and comfort that makes the whole thing that much more disarming.
I think totally. The casting of sorry, go ahead, David.
No, I was just gonna say it's part of, to me, it's part of like what I think is one of the strengths of the film, which is this feeling that TV and images are everywhere. I mean, those sequences where Mickey and Mallory are, you know, like in hotel rooms, and there's like cowboy movies and horror movies that are being projected outside of the windows. It reminds me of like Muppet Babies and Pee-wee's Playhouse. Like both of those did that thing where it's sort of like you opened a door and there was like some old movie like outside.
Yeah.
Yes.
Love that stuff. And it feels like the way that the media is just sort of like, I don't know, it's saturated the whole world that they live in, and that part, even Juliette Lewis's character, her abusive childhood is portrayed as a sitcom, and like all of it is just, to me, that's the best part of this movie, is just how deftly he wraps media into every element of it.
Yeah.
Even though it's total sensory fucking overload.
Yes. Well, that's the thing, right? He's saying this is sort of the lens through which we understand our world, is like the language of TV and film. And it is a manic way to make sense of the world. Like he's really like pulling that up to the surface. On just one point on the back on the part about Rodney Dangerfield, I think that's brilliant casting, him specifically. And I don't know that there are very many other people who could function in this film the way that he does. This familiarity that we're talking about of like, a comedic talent who's sort of like a little bit like raunchy, but still, like the guy that you can like watch with your family potentially, or at least like is somewhat more wholesome than the monster that he portrays in the film, I think is really important, because the role that he plays in that sitcom that, is sort of an exaggeration of a dream or a memory that she has, is that of like a Leave It to Beaver dad, right?
Right.
But like a very perverted, terrible version of him. And like Rodney Dangerfield is the perfect like frequency in between those two things to bridge the gap between a sitcom dad, from the 50s and 60s, and this like horrible, disgusting, gropey man that he is. And so it is like, it's at once this feeling of like betrayal, because you're like, Rodney, no. And then on the other hand, you're like, yeah, that's that it's that much more effective because you do have this relationship with him.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it feels like Rodney Dangerfield was kind of a weird figure, because when I was young, he was always around, and I thought he was from the 50s. Like I thought he always had a suit on. He seemed like he was always like with Johnny Carson, but it turned out, like I learned later, Rodney Dangerfield didn't become famous until like the 80s, I think.
Yep.
And so yeah, it is perfect that he's kind of like this out of time character.
Yeah, and going to the thing that you said, Carlee, I think it's really important. I've seen people, I think, misinterpret this. I'm not going to say misinterpret. Like I said, I think Oliver Stone is as confused as anybody is about exactly what the movie's meaning is. So a different interpretation of this film, I think, keeps it at a very sort of topical examination that says, these people were created by mass media, by, sort of like the American identity at the heart of all of these different things. I don't think that's true necessarily in my interpretation of it. I think what it is it's a movie constantly in search of a subjectivity that feels reliable, and it never finds it. And so those moments where we see the sitcom kind of meeting, it's also, remember, like a meet cute story between Mickey and Mallory. And as Carlee said, it's like, it's these two people who have no frame or context outside of mediation, of the hypermediation, with which to understand their existence, right? They've been kind of given these other images, and they can't quite square why their existence feels different and apart from what they're kind of told that it should be, right? Like, so it's not like them saying like, oh, television made them this way. It's like, no, they can only understand the world through television. Like, that's the thing that they're trying to make sense of, but that's a very fractured looking glass through which to try to understand the way that things operate in the real world.
Fractured and reductive,
right?
Which is like the problem we see today, right? It's like everyone has decided that politics are a Marvel movie, and that's not that will always fall short of an understanding of like the dynamics and structures of power at work. And I think like if Stone is doing anything really well, he is, whether he's meaning to or not, asserting that experience of the world and our understanding through mediated ideas and versions of people is one that is inherently corrupted.
Ironically, one of the most recent Marvel properties uses this same framing device of an old-timey sitcom.
Oh yeah,
where
I
like
feel like
there's
it's everywhere.
Yeah, like I know it's more popular now. We kind of said that this one sort of was maybe like a tip of the spear kind of thing, but it is funny the way that like media has co-opted this specific kind of like, oh, isn't the real world isn't the same as a sitcom, and now it's made its way to witches and robots in WandaVision.
Well, the Marvel thing is really interesting, and I agree with you with the feeling that there is a certain investment in kind of movies as almost like religious stories that are supposed to teach us how to be good, and
yes,
it's like if a character does something bad in a movie and he's not punished, then that's problematic. Is a really narrow, ugly way of looking at art, and it's like actually in line with like it's actually in line with like the censorship history of Hollywood and the Hays codes and all the stuff about like movies need to be a force more or less of transmitting positive values. Stone is intervening in that in a really interesting way. I mean, one thing I'm thinking about is I wonder what you guys think about the fact that like there's no one good in this movie. Like everyone is grotesque. Like every single character. That's what makes it to me an emotionally draining and overwhelming experience, and maybe like an unpleasant experience because everyone fucking sucks. It's like just even the people who get killed are just like these grotesque monsters. Like it's just a really ugly vision of American society. And the other part of it is like I'm wondering, well, how does that square with Stone's role in Hollywood? Because like we know that we know Oliver Stone is like this big left-wing guy, right? Like he's like a guy who's interested in telling us about capitalism. I mean, he's more or less, I mean, Michael Moore in his politics, he actually probably more radical than that. He's just kind of a tanky. Like Oliver Stone goes over to like Russia and like talks with Putin and stuff, whatever. But like I'm thinking about, I guess, like how do we square the left-wingness of Oliver Stone with natural born killers? Because that's the one clue to me is that like we know his politics, but at the same time, there's part of it feels socially conservative as a film because it's sort of like, oh, we're too violent as a culture and we need to like have better media or something. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, I mean, it is an inherently kind of reactionary framework that he's operating within, right? I don't think. I don't think leftists are absolved from ever accidentally falling into those sorts of ideological kind of loopholes like that. And Oliver Stone especially is someone from kind of a different era, sort of like a Vietnam era, of left-wingedness that kind of calluses over, or starts to feel a little bit more kind of moderate as we move further into time and
or just
progress.
Old-fashioned something. Yeah,
it's a little old-fashioned. I think for me, your enjoyment of this movie, I'll say this more broadly, your enjoyment of this movie, I think, is dependent on whether or not you think Oliver Stone believes himself complicit in the indictment or not. Whether or not he also sees himself as a guilty party in terms of like his portrayal of this sort of glorification or fantasization around violence in media and around the mediation of culture.
Do you think that he does view himself as complicit?
I don't know. I like to believe so. Yes, I think because I enjoy this movie. I think it's really good. And because the movie, I think, so often while towing that line falls on one side or the other, it feels kind of it's certainly heavy-handed It's but also like
that's an understatement.
I think subtlety is overrated as a value, and especially as a judgment system for art. I think sometimes you need a blunt object, and I'm okay with it.
This is a
if it's
polemic,
done,
right? I mean, it
yeah.
really is. It's meant to be. It's not meant to be a nuanced reflection of all the subtle elements of violence in American society. It's meant to like have a giant thesis and hit you over the head with it over and over again. I don't know. It made sense in '94. It really did, because it was like that's the.
Yeah.
I mean, he really
Yeah.
I feel like part of the history of this movie is that he kind of hit the moment right, because in '94 this was when the like Tanya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan thing was happening. This is when, I mean, in '94 was and before had been, you're already like leading into an era where like tabloid culture and the stuff like the stuff that that Robert Downey Jr.'s character is supposed to represent, this like,
Yes.
slime ball. I don't know if you guys remember like Current Affair and Hard Copy and all this bullshit.
Oh
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, that was. I mean, that seems like Natural Born Killers. It's funny because it's like it seems like reaction to that, but also like takes place in that world. It's an extension of it. It's capitalizing on the same impulses.
Yes, I totally agree. I am guilty of watching when I was younger America's Most Wanted.
Love that
yeah.
show.
It's like-
Yeah.
Cops was one of like the highest watched shows on like TV up
Yeah.
until it got, summarily canceled because of the 2020 demonstrations.
Right. Yeah.
What an
it's
era. It's almost like a lead up to social media, because you're like, people were all of a sudden, you wanted to see real shit. Like Jerry Springer was also
Yes.
popular during this time, where you just
Yeah.
saw like, I want to see trashy regular people fighting, and like Mickey and Mallory totally seem like they're an extension of that Jerry Springer universe, and we were looking for. That's the thing, is like, I guess who's complicit in this too, because the audience is part of this, and he portrays like
Yes.
Americans as like pretty stupid and just eating this shit up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Mhm.
I'm so glad you mentioned this. This is what I wanted to talk about. I think this is like particularly germane to the conversation around Blonde, which I won't get into for fear of getting canceled.
Is it out? I haven't seen it yet. It's
No,
it's not
so
out, right?
It played at Venice. I think it also played at TIFF. It's gonna do like a theatrical run for the next like couple of weeks, and then it's going on to Netflix, I think, next weekend.
Oof, I
at
love
the time of
all that
recording.
guy's movies. So
Me too.
I'm looking forward
Yeah.
to it. Yeah.
Again, another
What's
person.
the problem?
Another person who loves using a blunt object. He's not subtle at all either. Andrew Dominic. So,
But this is the thing, right? It's like, is there a belief that media can and should indict institutions of power, and the sort of corrupted corners of our society by utilizing the images and like sigils of those things?
Sure.
There are some people that believe, no, that is not possible. You must not show those things. Those things are not allowed, and they cannot ever be used to make a point about the things that they are supposedly indicting. I disagree. And I think that within the right hands, forcing an audience to participate in and perhaps confront their own salaciousness towards violence and other things that we deem evil, that I think that under the right hands, that can be a really effective tool for subversion, and in some rare cases, like radical art. And I don't know that Stone is quite there, but he's more there than most other directors, particularly with this film. And so when you say, David, like that he's using this like blunt object, like that to me is not only indicting himself and the audience, but I think he's also forcing us to ask the question of like, what are the kinds of movies that tell stories that are moralizing? Like, are they always these like nice sort of like Oscar baity, like, Amistad or whatever? Or like, are they films that actually like entrench us in the very things that we are like most ashamed of in our
Mhm.
society.
Yeah, yeah. No, that it's. I mean, it's a provocation, and I think I think you're right, Aaron. And I don't really know what he means by it in some ways. The more the like, I feel like he has a chaotic kind of perspective on this stuff, and that works with the aesthetic because the aesthetic is chaos too, and it's meant to sort of like drill this notion into your mind that we're sort of living in that chaos. It seems like the film. It's weird because it's like an editorial, right? Like it's a movie, and I think that's part of my problem with it. Is like I've seen this movie a million times. I've watched a lot of Oliver Stone's movies. I love this aesthetic. I probably watched The Doors 1,000 times in high school too. But
Yes.
like, I don't know. Natural Born Killers now seems like of its time a little bit. Like it seems like it's an argument made about a particular moment in culture. There's no internet here. Like there's no. I mean, it doesn't take place in quite the same America, even though a lot of the same big ideas are there. I don't know if that makes sense.
It totally does, and I think that you're right. It really is lightning in a bottle, but it's because of its proximity to all of these big media events, right? Like this is only a few years removed from the Rodney King incident. This is
which is in the movie.
Which is
Rodney King,
right.
yeah,
Yes.
and which Spike Lee did with that with Malcolm X as well, right? With
Mhm.
Rodney King, and it felt like this was sort of like the big filmmakers, the big auteurs were doing something where they were noticing media and kind of inserting it in their movies this way. Natural Born Killers seems like the maximum movie that's like about media of this time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's only a couple of like months removed because this came out in like August of 94. So it's only a handful of months after like the beginnings of the OJ Simpson trial,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Like,
Yeah.
and it finds its way into the movie too, like Juice is right there, like on the screen at the end. And so the editing process for this movie, by the way, must have been insane. I just think about like how much effort had to go into that, and then also like having all this stuff happen after you have like a final edit of the movie and being like, okay, now let's put this in here too.
It's a radically edited movie for a Hollywood movie, right? Like
Mhm.
it doesn't feel like many Hollywood movies have this many cuts, this many weird angles. It feels like, and maybe that's what we're lamenting in part with the '90s in terms of nostalgia. What was it better in the '90s? I don't know, but like the part, I think Hollywood paid for people to do adventurous stuff.
Yes.
And Oliver Stone was someone who, for whatever reason, had a lot of capital at that moment, and it felt like he could make whatever he wanted. And the result was some, I don't know, really intense movies. I don't think if Natural Born Killers is something that Hollywood would take a risk on today. It would have a very different. It just feels like a totally impossible movie to make in the 21st century. I could be wrong about that, but
No, you're 100% right. There's no fucking way this would make it past anyone's table. Like this film is not only talking about things that I think very few movies like explore in the way that he is exploring them, but it's also a movie that is meant to make you uncomfortable, and no one fucking wants that anymore. Everyone wants films right now, or assumes that people want films that make you feel good, baby bird everything down your gullet for you, leave no rock or idea unexplained or unindicted, right? It's like we've had this conversation on the show before where it's like a character does something problematic, and if you don't like have a person in the movie saying what you did is problematic, then like the movie is viewed as like inherently endorsing that thing. Like there's just no room for audience participation in the construction of art, right? Like we are, as an audience viewing this film, we are completing the piece for Stone. Like,
right.
It doesn't exist in its full sort of spectrum of ideas and experiences without an audience watching it. And that is something that Hollywood does not care about or spend time and money on. And I think particularly when it comes to movies that are examining institutions of power through very charged, explicit imagery, that's definitely not a territory that anyone wants to go in, except for, say, Andrew Dominic, and like everyone's losing their fucking shit about it.
I was gonna bring this point up, you know, and to be clear, we have not seen the movie. I do not know whether or not the movie is going to be good. For all I know, it could be a complete and utter failure. But you know, there's so many of these kind of charged, like, finger pointing questions that I'm getting, that Carlee's getting, like all of our friends when people talk about this movie online, which is like, why do you want to see this? And part of my reason, I think, stems from what we're talking about here, which is, you know, we don't really let filmmakers make provocations anymore with studio money and allow them the opportunity to like fail miserably at trying to like make these sort of like blunt artistic statements in ways that are uncomfortable and unsettling and maybe in somewhat bad taste. You know, like we just don't allow that to happen anymore. It's like a thing that and it's not because we have a newfound like moral clarity or anything like that. It is because it's not a thing that like people are willing to take a risk on anymore, you know, and it's all sort of it's very driven by capital. It's not driven by any sort of moral impulse.
100%. It's the profit margin that needs to be, that has become so extreme at this point that like there's no room for films that, you know, make a little bit of their money back, right? It's like everything has to be like, okay, we spent $2 billion on it and it made $100 billion or whatever it is. Like it's insane. And
that's
the
been
last
coming
thing
for a long time, right? Like that the interview with Charlie Rose that Oliver Stone in '94 is saying that exact thing. He's like, there's so much pressure to like open in a giant weekend that I feel like I can't really take risks. We have to make a movie that we know is going to hit on all cylinders. It feels like Natural Born Killers is actually that movie. It made a shitload of money.
Yes,
it's a sensational, huge hit. But there's not a lot of that happening now.
We should talk about that. Like, what do you make of this? Like, considering what Oliver Stone is leveling at us, like, what do you make of this film being such a fucking smash hit?
Because it's got
American
all that sensational
audiences?
stuff, right? I mean, I remember actually like shaking when I first saw this movie. The opening scene at a diner when they're like killing people in the diner, I felt like exhilarated, honestly, in the same way I felt when I first played Grand Theft Auto, and I was able to, you know, just lay people out with a gun in the middle of the street, and I'm like, what is wrong with me? Why am I so excited about this? Because the other part of me is like horrified. But that whatever dialectic that is at work there is entirely what Stone seems to be playing with, right?
Yeah.
Like it's weird because on the one hand, he seems like he's totally moralizing in a really obvious way. On the other part of it, to me, seems like he's just pointing out something that we don't talk about enough, which is how much our sort of attention is driven by salaciousness, and I don't know. Maybe that's a bigger conversation about like, why are we into this stuff? Stone has that sequence with Russell Means, that like awful sequence in like the TP.
Yes.
Like, and there's it's the only scene he does this, right, where they project words onto Mickey and Mallory, and it says like too much TV, and I'm kind of like, is this like supposed to be his like Native American subjectivity, like looking at these white men these white people with like the word demon on them, etc. Like that was the one attempt I felt like where Stone was trying to like maybe investigate the like original sin of American history or something.
Yeah, for
like,
sure.
Yeah,
it was kind of clumsily done, but either way, there's a feeling that the American people are into Mickey and Mallory. I don't know. Part of it is weird because the era of mass shooting that happens afterwards, it's not like the media made darlings out of all these mass shooters. Instead, we're just kind of like depressed by it and disgusted by it, and it didn't really go like, we don't have a Mickey and Mallory, really. Like, I don't know who that Bonnie and Clyde character is post Natural Born Killers, but like the media isn't exactly like the way he's portraying it. It is a cartoonish vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, I took that exaggeration to be more sort of making the point that like the media fetishizes these people in their coverage, not necessarily in the sense that like turns them into people that, you know, we aspire to be, but in their coverage. And speaking of Spike Lee, he talked about this with regards to Summer of Sam, and people were asking him, you know, at the time, like, you know, you're devoting an entire movie to like about this, like, that's not okay. And he points out like the New York Times, all these other publications made, you know, tenfold profits by covering this murderer. Like, why are they not being indicted? Why are they not put on the same, you know, cross that I am? And so I think like I took the stuff about the sort of celebritization of Mallory and Mickey to be less a literal translation to what happens in real life and more just sort of a commentary on the way the media, you know, sensationalizes these images and makes them a part of, you know, the everyday landscape.
Yeah.
Their characters.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in covering them, you know, whether it's done so sort of morosely or with an excitedness, there is still potentially an issue, because I think what Stone is saying is like, you're just adding to the landscape of violence that we're, you know, operating in. Like we're hungry for this kind of thing, and the media knows that. And this is represented very literally in Robert Downey Jr.'s character.
Yeah, I think it's telling that the literally the man with the movie camera in the movie is the one that crosses the threshold between like civilian and like participant in the violence, you know.
That's a great point. Yeah.
And so I don't think that, you know, to go to the question earlier, you know, asking like, oh, does Stone feel himself guilty in this these implications? I think to an extent. And I also, you know that we haven't mentioned him too much, but another reason for the success of this movie is very likely the fact that Quentin Tarantino's name is attached to it. You know, this is 1994, so this is Pulp Fiction, but it's also coasting off of the backs of Reservoir Dogs and a hit in like True Romance as well. You know, he was the hottest thing in Hollywood for a few years there, and everyone wanted a piece of whatever he had. And his original script focused, I think, more principally on the Wayne Gale character, on Robert Downey Jr.'s character and his sort of infatuation with and participation in the violence that Mickey and Mallory were committing.
That's really interesting. It makes me wonder what Tarantino's vision was, because I know he disowned this movie, and I mean I was looking around for more extensive comments from him about it, but I didn't really find anything. I know he has a book coming out this fall. I don't know if he'll talk about it in there, but I felt like in some ways I'm wondering like why would Tarantino be so upset about Stone's version of his story? You know, what is the problem? How did he feel he misinterpreted it or made it a different way? That's an interesting question to me, because in some ways it does feel like the media's vision of a Tarantino movie, because like I love how like the media still thinks like whenever they talk to Tarantino, I say the media, I mean like Hollywood media, it's always like they ask like they ask about violence. They just assume that Tarantino's only thing is violence and that he's the only guy in Hollywood that makes violent movies, etc. When he's really like, when you're talking about like people that make provocations and films that still like ask us to intervene on violence in some way and think about it. I mean, Tarantino's one of the last remaining figures that Hollywood pays for to do that. But at the same time, there's all this hand-wringing about his stuff that's still that feels very 90s. Like whenever people bring up Tarantino, it feels very, very 90s. I mean, I think he's that really great clip of him where someone asked him, I think it's actually about the portrayal of Margot Robbie in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood at the film festival, and he says, "I reject your hypothesis." And I'm like, that's a guy who's been asked the same fucking question for 25 years.
Yes.
And it feels like that's there in Natural Born Killers. He's already sort of thinking about media and violence, but we get Stone's vision of Tarantino's story.
Yeah.
that hand-wringing is parroted by movie-going audiences. Like I think there's, and this is where I find the media complicit. I actually think that one of the biggest sins is not just the sort of proliferation of violent images, but rather the moralizing of the existence of those images, which they themselves perpetuate, right? Like it's hilarious to me, someone who operates in and around media asking a director about violent images. I'm like, that's literally the currency you all operate in.
It's art, man. I mean, I really think of I just think of films as paintings in a lot of ways, and in the sense of like, you know, all of these tones and shades, whether it be violence or sexual assault or any of these horrible things, are part of the world and part of the paint that filmmakers use. I mean, it'd be really weird to like go to Picasso and talk to him about Guernica and be like, wow, you're putting a lot of violence up on that on that canvas, brother. Why don't you make something positive for us to look at? It's kind of like, what the fuck are artists for then? Like,
right.
I mean, that is a debate, right? I mean, people do have different visions and expectations of what art is supposed to be. We are the cinephile type people who are like, we want art to be challenging and fucked up, and I don't care if it's fucked up because it's part of the sort of palette of our world. But I mean, I have to recognize, in part because I've taught classes on film, that to younger people who have deeply different visions of what film is supposed to be, and for them, they don't want to see stuff that's unpleasant, and that to me is crazy. But you know, different strokes.
Different strokes. I think like part of that is, I'm going to make a broad assertion here that is not founded on anything other than my observance of the world and people in it.
A hot take, I believe, is what that's described as.
Yes. Hot take, yes. I think like the demand for images that are not ever challenging, unpleasant, I don't know, painful in any way, is a response to how painful just existence has become, and how
totally
how much
we need screensavers, baby, just to bliss out to
100%. And rather than taking a critical posture toward the structural and institutional powers that are creating the immiseration we are all entrenched in every single day, we point our finger at a movie or a filmmaker or an author. And that's all well and good. Like, if you want to, you know, restrict that pedophile's access to capital, I will not stop you. But that's not the source of the problem, right? And that's where I think like I find this perspective of like this totally perfect veneer of virtue to be a completely flawed one, because you want an escape. I understand that, but the escape through, you know, media alone and media that is just soft and warm and comfortable is not the escape that's actually going to solve the problems. Like, you need a material escape. You need support and community and uplift that come outside of the things you consume. And that is like a place that people can't get to. Our only sort of axis rather of agency is believed to be this like mechanism of consumption. And that's like not true, first of all. And that like is a shitty existence for you to be like, oh, the only place I have power and control over like what my lived experience is in the things I watch. That sucks.
Yes. But if we have a device in our pocket that like allows us to watch something constantly, then yeah, you're describing something that's like drug addiction. Like I need the nice stuff at me, and then sometimes the bad medicine. Natural Born Killers feels like bad medicine in some ways, right? Like it feels like it's meant to fuck that up, that dynamic up in some ways. And yeah, fewer and fewer people want that, I think, and that it is a product of like. The kind of stuff that the filmmakers were really concerned about when they were making the movie. It was like, do people really want to watch more of this when the world itself is this now? Like it seemed like there was an uptick in violence or violent attitudes. Again, that was a media creation, but it's still, I think you're right. Like people want to be comforted, but in that comfort, they end up sort of falling further into the very structures that are creating the discomfort in the first place and the need for sedating kind of content.
Yeah, it renders us completely complacent with the violence that exists outside of that screen. It's like, if I can find respite in a TV show that feels good, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but if that's all there is, then we are removing any sort of like antagonism towards the external structures. And that's where I think art can be potentially subversive and radical, is like, if Oliver Stone is giving us 2 hours of shit that we're like, oh God, like this is like concentrate. This is like black tar America that I'm just booting directly into my veins. Like, then, maybe
episode
we might
title Black
we
Tar
should,
America.
yes.
Because this was the heroin age too in the 90s.
It
Right?
totally was. Maybe like leaving that screening, I'm thinking a little bit more about like the why behind, like, why is life this way? Why is life in America this way? Like, and maybe that is like a seed toward some sort of, liberatory experience. I'm not making the argument that Natural Born Killers is necessarily like revolutionary or radical art, but I think the complete dismissal of anything challenging removes us of the opportunity to have radical art, to have experiences and stories showcased that force us to confront things that we aren't normally forced to confront elsewhere.
I agree.
I've got one more thing to say on this, and then I promise we'll get it back onto Natural Born Killers. But I think one of the things that I see under remarked upon with this argument about sort of like a kind of purity test with media, with content, with art, what have you, is that we so routinely absolve our current worldview and sort of deign it to be pure, right? That it's good. And the truth of it, the reality of it is that if you're alive in 2022 in the United States of America, I promise you that some of the things that you are being fed, I promise you some of the things that you internalize as a value system are inherently fucked up. Like they're bad.
No, that couldn't be.
and so like, I had this conversation online with some friends the other day. A fellow podcast are doing a show about 300, the Zack Snyder movie.
Oh God.
And huge commercially successful movie. A lot of people like that movie. I like that movie, and I think it's interesting. It's visually very arresting. I have my problems with it, what have you, but like it is a very admiring rendering of a sort of fascist eugenicist kind of like society, right? Like it has this very sort of ubermensch kind of like deifying quality to it that is very challenging and very like,
Yeah.
But I didn't hear many people talking about that when it came up, right? Because it was kind of like married in sort of like this genre fiction, and also because like it just, again, it wasn't blunt. It wasn't a one-to-one like this movie is about fascism or anything. You could
easily miss it.
You can miss it, right? And because for whatever reason, like people took to it. People found, like I knew people, I grew up in a pretty conservative community. I grew up kind of like in the church as well. I knew people who like internalized that idea of like 300 like masculinity, and we're like, this is badass, like this is cool, right? Like we should be killing babies that are born weird like that.
But you didn't get fascist pilled while you watched it?
No, I didn't. Right. I survived to today, and I'm able to look at it critically. And that's ultimately the point. It's like, yeah, it's just interesting the way that, like we set our sights on things that have a more obvious kind of reflection of a sort of uh cultural value system, or problem in culture that we want to critique and say like, you mustn't look at that, like divert your eyes, whereas a lot of other things in society are just sort of intrinsically imbued with a lot of these same problematic visions, and pass idly by because they couch it in more shit.
Marvel movies, perfect example.
Marvel movies are a perfect example. Yeah.
We use the concept on our show of the Trojan horse a lot to think about, like, I mean, actually with Andrew Dominic and his film Killing Them Softly, the Trojan horse as being like, the filmmaker that and the artist, because I mean Brad Pitt is sort of a Trojan horse in his own way in his career of like inserting certain ideas, thematic ideas about violence and capitalism, particularly into their films. And the Trojan horse, I feel like there are fewer and fewer filmmakers that are doing that. Like the maximalist film, like the Natural Born Killers is a maximalist film, right? Like this sort of genre of like just giant pulsating, everything firing at all cylinders. Like Wolf of Wall Street, I feel like is a Trojan horse film in its own way, right? Where it's like you sort of like, and that's why it's a similar film in the sense of how it was received, right? People look at it like, wow, Scorsese made this like gross celebration of like frat boy Wall Street behavior. Right. And you're like, well, he's painting with those tones, right? The fact that you are saying this is just a celebration means that that's how you sort of witnessed it, right? Where, and I'm again not saying like there's an absolute meaning on this stuff, but it's pretty hard to miss in things in Wolf of Wall Street and Natural Born Killers, that these filmmakers are obviously sort of intervening on the excitement of the image themselves in order to kind of play with what's underneath. And that seemed really obvious with those movies, but again, people fucking miss it, right? It's like, because that part of it is maybe the medium is the message, where it's kind of like, okay, you see Wolf of Wall Street, you see Natural Born Killers, all you see is the violence and the hell and the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and maybe miss, like, I don't know, there's something tonally going on in those films that are a lot more critical than the content might suggest, I guess.
Yep, absolutely. You know who celebrates Wall Street, gang, is Barack Obama.
Ooh, burned.
Uh-oh.
Like, this is my point, right?
Yeah,
it's like, it's easy to point at Martin Scorsese and say,
right,
oh, like, you're lauding like all of these Wall Street guys and bro culture. And it's like, that's a movie. Okay, first and foremost, let's talk about the way that like our society does that in real life and destroys people's lives as a result of that pedestaling. Like that's where I get really incensed, because I'm like, you think that policing these images is you policing something real, and it's not. Like, take that antagonistic posture and put it towards the institutions of power that are actually creating the things that you think this movie is celebrating.
Like, what would the Wolf of Wall Street movie be if it if it sacified these conditions? I guess it would be the first Wall Street, Oliver Stone, where like people are punished at the end, and you find out who the good guys and bad guys are, and that seems like the Marvel thing is very much a product of that, right? This sort of like, really, I need to know who the good guy is, and I need to know who the bad people are, and that's that. When I guess the society has become much, much more uncomfortable with sort of seeing dynamic characters where you're kind of like unsure how you feel about them. There's a line in I'm such a 90s guy, but like in Swingers, where Vince Vaughn says like, I don't want you to be the PG-13 guy that everybody's pulling for. I want you to be like the guy in the R-rated movie where you're not sure if you like the guy or not. You're not
Yes.
like that. That's sort of like, I mean, that was the 70s, right? Like the 70s were filled with fucking movies where it's like, this guy's awesome, but holy shit, he just did something really insane. Like I mean, characters that are like committing crimes like sexual assault, where you all of a sudden feel like I am spinning inside in terms of how I feel about this stuff. It feels like there's not really a thirst for that, and certainly it's not profitable.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, this lands us back to the point about people wanting things that are easy and sort of already decided and digested for them. They don't want to do any digesting. They don't want to do any sort of completing the thought or like coming to their own conclusions. They want all the conclusions fed to them, and they want it to be really obvious. And I think it's a chicken and egg thing, right?
Yeah.
I think that the strictures of capital have created movies that exist on that plane, and so audiences have come to expect and demand it. And likewise, I think, you know, as the decline of our society has marched on, like people have become more adamant about like things being black and white because things feel so exigent. And that's not, it's not to say that's not, there isn't some kernel of like validity there, but I think again, it's like it's placing all of the weight on media and not necessarily and art, and not necessarily like placing it on the institutions that are creating the circumstances that we're responding to.
Totally. Yeah, I agree. I mean, and part of me hopes that we've moved on a little bit from like just like the TV made people crazy thing, but like at the same time, I'm kind of like social media literally did make people crazy. So I think you're right in sort of in the sense of like it makes me think that the internet created, and social media in particular, created such a fractured reality that people do see. Like that's what clickbait is for. It's like there's a kind of need for something solid to grab a hold of. It feels like even conspiracy theory like allows people to feel like I know something, you know, like I know something and I'm right and my worldview is correct. And that's a need that's really dangerous because, you know, people become certain about something in a way that is a product of their uncertainty about everything else. And that to me is like, yeah, that's definitely part of that Natural Born Killers discourse. I mean, this movie made me think of a million other movies. I was thinking about Fight Club as well. Like Fight Club is, I don't know if you guys are going to do Fight Club, if you've done Fight Club, but it's like the ultimate 90s movie yet. In some ways. But it seems like it's like similar territory, right? You're like watching two criminals together. You're like, it's about the media and violence, but it's totally different in terms of its aesthetic approach and its sort of value system. And it's only, 5 years later? Yeah, something like that?
Yeah, it's 99. That's right.
Feels way more modern to me. I'd say this because I just watched Fight Club the night before I watched Natural Born Killers, and I'm like, Fight Club seems like it's in a totally different world, even though it's talking about the same shit. They're looking at the TV and they're saying like, oh, the TV made us this way. There's like sort of like TV baby discourse going on in Fight Club.
Yeah.
You know what's funny though is like I actually think that Stone anticipated a little bit of the dynamic that we have with the internet and with social media, in the sense that his films, particularly JFK and Natural Born Killers, and to a lesser extent The Doors, all kind of like put you on this like unsettled footing of like collaging like real imagery or like images that are parodying like something real, like the American Maniacs like show logo, then towards the end like cutting real footage from trials and, you know, images of Waco, Texas into the film, right? So he's creating this environment where like you are interacting with things that are artifice and narrativized, but then you are also interacting with things that are real life images, but that are also to a lesser extent narrativized. And that I think speaks to this mindset that we have with social media and the internet today, where it's like, we think we have a handle on like what's real and what isn't, when the fact of the matter is that when you're online, like everything's up for grabs, right?
Mhm.
Like there's this sort of delusion that, oh, if I'm reading this like piece from the New York Times, like these are facts and not propaganda. Or like, when I'm investigating this thing myself, when I'm on fucking, QAnon Reddit or whatever it is, like I'm diving into the real story. And all of it is artifice and all of it is manipulated to a certain extent. And I really like that Stone, even though he's not using those same mediums, is like inserting us as an audience into that same landscape.
Totally. Yeah, I feel that.
I cut you off. Sorry.
No, you didn't actually. I thought I had a point and now I don't anymore.
I wanted to ask you, David, specifically about Tommy Lee Jones's character in this film.
Oh my God. We should
Speaking
talk
of The
about like the
Fugitive,
performances.
right? Yeah.
Speaking of The Fugitive, yes.
Yeah, we haven't talked about the people that are in this movie at all. Like Tom
No, we should probably
Sizemore
do
before
that.
he completely boned out of Hollywood on drugs, and Tom Sizemore was such an electric character or figure in '90s movies, and then just went away. But
he was on that Dr. Drew show.
That's right. Yeah, it's a
the
sad
celebrity
story.
rehab one. It is really sad.
Wait, he was?
Yeah, he was on like a later season of like celebrity rehab.
He got into like smoking meth and shit like that.
Yeah,
like,
he
really
was
bad.
Oh,
yeah.
I didn't know that.
He was struggling with addiction.
I knew he was struggling with addiction. I didn't know that he went on sort of like a televised, adventure of his recovery.
God. Yeah, he really had some struggles. To tie it to something that we just had Molly Lambert, the host of Heidi World, on our show, and Tom Sizemore was with Heidi Fleiss for a significant portion of the 90s.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, which was again like tabloid celebrity. It was one of those stories. But yeah, Tommy Lee Jones is really fucking like disgusting in this movie. I mean, they all are pushing it. It's clear that Stone wanted them to like push it to the like maximum cartoon grossness, like Tom Sizemore, and I feel like Tommy Lee Jones characters are like licking their lips a lot.
Yes.
They're like just really gross. His mustache is really gross. It's interesting because like the character, I mean, it kind of subverts his Tommy Lee Jones's sort of like coolness in a way coming off of The Fugitive, because The Fugitive, he had such a like, it's almost like this Tommy Lee Jones had found his voice, and it was that character in The Fugitive, right? And then he just goes and does weird stuff with Oliver Stone, where he played like a gay millionaire guy in JFK.
Yeah,
right?
I was gonna say
Yes.
I was gonna say it feels like a more cartoonish version of that character.
Totally, yeah.
And this actually, to me, this prison warden feels like a precursor to his Two-Face in Batman Forever.
Oh my God,
fuck.
100%.
I forgot about that. Yeah. Speaking of comic book movies.
Yeah.
Hey, there's a nuanced character. You don't know whether he's good or bad because he's sort of like both, right?
He's both, right?
What do we do? What do we make of him?
Man, he's a morally great character.
No, but I wanted to ask you like what you made of Tommy Lee Jones, specifically his casting, which I think you touched on as like the prison warden, but like the role that he plays in the film, particularly the back half. Like, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, but there was I had like a bunch of like mixed feelings watching him.
I mean, the only thing I'm thinking about is The Fugitive again, because he in The Fugitive he plays such like a positive vision of what law enforcement could be, whereas in this film he plays the opposite, like the nightmare of what law enforcement is, basically like a plantation slave owner or overseer is how it's portrayed. So it makes me wonder about like the consciousness of that and even like Jones's politics, because I'm sort of like, he often plays that like lawman, that good lawman. I mean, No Country for Old Men is another example of him like playing this like lawman who's like the good guy, the one that we actually feel like, oh, this is why I'm not an ACAB person, because they're actually good cops and it's Tommy Lee Jones. But in the future, or in Natural Born Killers, he's not that at all. He's like the nightmare, and so is Scagnetti, the character played by Tom Sizemore. Every institution here is corrupt. There's no. That's what's kind of weird, is how one note it is. It's just sort of like everything is repulsive, and like Mickey and Mallory. I wonder what you guys think of Woody Harrelson and Juliette Lewis in this movie? I'd love to hear, because like they were hot stars at the time. They were fucking huge.
Yeah. I don't know what Woody did between this and White Men Can't Jump in 92, but yeah, he was doing like mostly comedy stuff. And I in another conversation with Oliver Stone, I saw that he like specifically picked Woody and Juliet because of their unique ability to kind of emulate his vision of like white trash Americana.
Sure.
And I think they do a good job with that for sure. Like I think of Juliette Lewis's mullet throughout this movie.
And just
but
her, that's her. So she embodies that like
She
perfectly.
does.
Yeah.
I love Juliette Lewis now. So
She's a fucking badass.
I was not a huge fan of hers for a long time, and whatever it was, I think we watched like Strange Days and maybe a couple other things, and also just like recently seeing her come back for Yellow Jackets, that Showtime series. I am like now like a switch flipped, and so like I see her now and I'm like, I love her. She's amazing. And she's really captivating in this movie. I think she has like a really good performance. She is super young here too, has to be, because she was in Cape Fear a couple of years before this and playing a teenager.
God,
but
Scorsese, Oliver Stone. I mean, they were. She was everywhere in this.
She was.
Yeah, and she did edgy stuff too. I always felt like, oh, like this girl, if she's in a movie, it's probably going to be interesting. And that broke down in the late '90s, but that's another story. But for a while, I mean, there was. We haven't mentioned it, but like, the 90s were an edgy moment in movies, and like there was this sort of indie thing going on, and Tarantino, I guess we have mentioned it, Tarantino embodies that thing. If like all of a sudden Hollywood's looking for new ideas. I mean, it is kind of like a micro 70s in a little bit, right?
Yes.
It's like Hollywood's searching. They know. I mean, I just had a conversation on my show about MTV. At the same time, MTV in the 90s is like, they know their audience is changing. They know people are looking at other media now. They know the internet is coming. They know people are getting older, and they're looking for something. And in Hollywood, that comes out as sort of like edgy, subversive filmmakers that are not necessarily political. Like, I mean, Kevin Smith made his entry into Hollywood at this moment because he was just making movies that were tapping into a way that people talked that wasn't really present. I mean, this is when Beavis and Butthead is going to come out, like South Park's coming. There is conservatives are going to go nuts about this stuff, obviously, and feel like the world has gone to hell. But at the same time, there is kind of, I don't know, there's a sort of punk rock thing going on, and Woody Harrelson and especially Juliette Lewis are sort of there in that. I don't know. Certain actors you feel like, I trust these people because they're doing interesting stuff, even if it's not like the director that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Conservatives in every decade, in every century will freak out and think that the world is going to hell. That's their lot in life. But no, I think it's interesting too that Woody Harrelson came from Cheers, right? And he's like a totally different character than a lot of the roles he ended up playing in the 90s, and even to this day. Like, we just watched
Triple Nine.
Yes, we just watched Triple Nine, and he plays a detective, an alcoholic. He's a great character in the film, but again, he's like tapping into this sort of like darker, like rawness, which where his career started is very much not that place. But he, in this movie, I think embodies something really important, which is like that sort of charisma that that Stone is ascribing to figures like Woody, or rather Mickey.
Right.
That Woody Harrelson is able to play this person who is, utterly horrific and completely depraved, and also kind of charming and like a smooth talker, and like he looks good, right? Like when he's in his murderer man costume that he shows up in all the comic versions of him, where he's like got that white t-shirt, his glasses, his hair's in a ponytail, and he's wearing the gun holster. Like, he looks really good. But he plays that like that very narrow line of like someone who you like are briefly deluded into thinking is charming, and also like a terrifying, horrible man. He plays that really well.
Yeah, that quality of his seems like it's something that filmmakers picked up on in the 90s and just have been exploiting ever since. And he kind of found like this. There's something unnerving about him. At the same time, he looks like this kind of like charming American farm boy type guy. I think it was the 90s that he had a reputation too in public as being like kind of a bad boy that smoked a lot of weed. And so like there was I mean, drugs were an element of this film. Like Natural Born Killers was, I went to UC Santa Barbara, which is a school that's like all like just a weed party school. And like we had like screenings of movies, and the double screening in the late 90s was Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and Natural Born Killers.
Yeah.
Like, that's the like 420 screening, right? And I'm like, what does it mean that like a bunch of stoned college kids want to go watch these quote unquote nightmare roller coaster rides into Twisted America or whatever, and weed is the sort of entryway. I guess what I'm getting at is that there is a kind of like, I don't know, it's a kind of rhyming of the 60s counterculture in the 90s that happens, and Stone is totally kind of like the carrier of that. And now I realize that, well, it makes sense that like boomers who experienced the 60s are kind of subtly present in the 90s too, and we end up with like Woodstock 94, Woodstock 99, Lollapalooza. If you watch Lollapalooza clips on YouTube of like Perry Farrell and all those like bands, I mean they're hippies. They're like it's like it is a redo, and it feels like Natural Born Killers in a weird way is like sort of like this is the legacy of 60s thinkers, and Stone is a 60s thinker who is kind of bringing that attitude towards what he sees in the 90s. I would say that his aesthetic is totally stolen in a lot of ways. I mean, he admits that, right? That like it's like he was, and stolen isn't maybe the right word. It's like he was intentionally taking what the world looked like, what television looked like, and the result is like a 2-hour. I think he described it this way. It's like a 2-hour MTV music video.
Yeah.
But like of that era, right? Like that black and white and color and all that stuff. I don't know. It feels like the 60s counterculture is there in this movie through Stone. And through the weed, too.
And through the weed. Yeah, I completely agree. And I don't know, just speaking on Oliver Stone's like aesthetic and style here, I was thinking about this. It has nothing to do with what you were saying, I guess, David, but just how kind of flat modern like movie making is in large, and yeah, there are still some people who are like really strong visual stylists, but there's nobody like who's the modern day Oliver Stone, like who's the next Oliver Stone who's doing stuff like this?
Vera Drew,
our friend Vera Drew, Free the People's Joker, everyone.
Oh god.
Maybe they're right, like working in a lot of different mediums,
that auteur model's sort of over, right? I mean, we've got like dinosaurs left. Paul Thomas Anderson is still there. David Fincher is still allowed to make movies,
right?
I mean, I guess Dominic has a couple more that they might pay for, but I don't know. It's a weird moment. I see those schedules for like Marvel movies, and they're like, these are the like 48 Marvel movies that are scheduled for next year. And it's just sort of mind-boggling, but that's the nostalgia trap part of me is like, and I think what you guys are doing with your podcast too is like, let's examine a previous decade as a way of sort of thinking about where investigating that thesis and that nostalgia idea, because we're not saying, oh, things were great in the 90s and now they're shit. Now they're shit, and they were also shit in the 90s, but there was something else going on as well. And I mean, Natural Born Killers rests at sort of at the apex of that transition in some way, because it's right before mass shootings explode into the national consciousness. It's right before the internet becomes the sort of dominant social and economic model. I mean, there's a lot going on, but Natural Born Killers feels like, I don't know how, I guess maybe we could close with like this question. I wonder what you guys think about the legacy of Natural Born Killers. Is it around? Because I don't feel like people are quoting this movie. Like, does it have a cultural cachet for people?
Yeah, we were kind of talking about this before we watched it, and kind of had the sense that in modern culture, Natural Born Killers is probably known more for its proximity to and its, I'll say inspiration, but I say that with like an asterisk.
Yes.
It's inspiration for a lot of sort of like copycat killers and acts of violence that were sort of, lended some ideas from this movie.
So the
and I think
controversy is what people remember more than the movie itself.
Yes.
I would argue that that's true.
Yeah.
Like that people remember that more than the actual film. And also just because like I have always, like I said, I've never seen this movie, and it wasn't because I didn't have interest, but I have heard from many people who have seen it who have just said, yeah, it's okay, it's messy, it's not a particularly subtle movie, it's kind of a blunt satire.
Gets a little repetitive and boring, I have to say, in the prison sequence. It's like just prison for once it becomes a prison film, I'm just like, this is going to last for an hour, and and it's just going to be like the same thing over and over.
Mm-hmm. But with Oliver Stone specifically, like, and I think this about JFK too. JFK is a movie with tons of problems, right? It's a movie that peddles in some like almost immediately debunked conspiracy theories that were like dated by the time the movie was released. It has like a very clear kind of like weird homophobic through line, like it's very unfriendly towards like the gay community. It calls them the homosexual underworld or something like that in the movie.
Basically asserts that gay people are why JFK is dead.
Right. And
those wily scheming gays in New Orleans.
Scheming gays in New Orleans dressing up as
JFK is still a better movie than Natural Born Killers, don't you think?
I think so, yeah. And my point is just that, like for all the problems that I can find in JFK narratively, all the problems I can find in Natural Born Killers in terms of its thesis being kind of muddied, as a stylist purely, there is no one else like Oliver Stone. No one makes a movie like Oliver Stone. And it's always mesmerizing. Like we there were a couple of moments that I just had to like rewind and rewatch in this, just because of the use of different mediums and film stocks and angles. Like it's just like a master like tactician playing with film. And on that front alone, it's a thing that I was not anticipating, because no one had told me to anticipate it, though I should have, but I'm kind of a latecomer. It's the kind of movie
that can make you a cinephile, honestly, because it calls attention so much to like the apparatus, and you're all of a sudden thinking about exactly what you just said, Aaron. You're like sitting there being like, how'd they do this? And like, wow, look at that. I mean, the sort of like floating convertible through the like through the sort of like back projection that they're doing.
Oh yeah, that stuff is so cool.
Yeah, and it looks very Tarantino too. Like this is this is the heroin sequence in Pulp Fiction is done that way. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Breathless, the Richard Gere movie, not the Godard Breathless, the like Richard Gere movie from like 1983. That movie is that aesthetic, like entirely. It's like Tarantino 100. It's a Pulp Fiction type movie, and it's got like that same car floating through the projection and stuff like that. But you're right. Oliver Stone, he's almost like Ken Burns in that like there's an aesthetic that is like a trademark. Like Oliver Stone created a particular way of looking that is totally his own. And I would say that in some ways he sort of like innovated so much that everything else became like him, and his stuff doesn't seem unique anymore.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now he's a
totally
podcaster.
Oh, well, he's got to do something in his old age. Yeah, on the question of like the legacy of this film, I had a thought where I was like, oh, should I post that like I'm watching this movie? Like, am I gonna get canceled? And that I think sums up like what we're talking about, right? Like I am aware of the fact that a lot of people think this movie is dangerous, particularly because it was expressly cited by people who committed very terrible acts of violence. But one of the things I think we've talked about over the course of this episode is like, is that real, right? Like they may think that it's this movie that is, commanding them to do X, Y, and Z, but there are clearly several intersecting forces of oppression and alienation that would cause a person to commit acts of violence like this. But I think the fact that I like had a brief pause and was like, oh, are people gonna like think that I'm endorsing the Columbine shooting by saying that I'm watching
That's so
this
funny.
movie?
It's funny that you guys have that association, because I don't think of this movie with Columbine at all. But now, obviously, I am, because I'm like the natural born killer thing. I remember reading about Columbine, them using NBK. But it's funny because the movie I associate with Columbine is The Matrix. When it came, people were like, "Oh, they wear trench coats and shit like that," and it was all ridiculous. Like that conversation, all of it was lame, and it was kind of like I think that I don't know that since we've had like Dylan and Eric, the two guys that committed the Columbine murders, since their vision became true, which is their vision was of like a world in which there were mass shootings all the time. It becomes a kind of opportunity for us to investigate, what kinds of people that create that. And I think that we've moved past the Matrix and the video games as right. Like we don't think. I feel like that's not the modern thinking of mass shootings. At this point, people are hopefully having a vision that's a little bit more complex than that. I don't know. Natural Born Killers is like it doesn't come down on one side or the other on this question, but because it brings up all the sexual assault stuff and all the kind of like the factors that created these people beyond the media. But it does feel like an intervention on America, and I feel like there were conservatives that hated this movie because they felt like it was an attack on American institutions. Like they saw it as exactly what it was. It's not hard to miss the point of this movie in some ways, because it is a pretty vicious attack on this sacred nation and its culture. Yeah.
Right. And that's the problem, right? People, I think, see this movie and think, oh, the violent images in this film cause violence in the real world. And not the violent images in this film are reflective of the violence that happens in the real world.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to be clear. I don't associate this movie with Columbine. I know that other people do.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Now I'm remembering that. Yeah.
And that is like, I think that sums up the sort of legacy nicely, is that like, or rather like in a fucked up way, that like people think about this movie and they think about like the violence that took place, in and around it. And that's the legacy of the film, and not what the film is actually doing, which, as you said, is indicting the institutions that like create a landscape of violence and access to guns and like all of that stuff. Like that the movie is not thought of as an indictment of those things. And I wish that it was, which is why I was actually really excited for us to talk about this film, because I think I will just say, like, I actually like it better than JFK, which is probably controversial and will get me canceled. But like, as an artistic statement and as sort of like an exploration of the power of images, not to corrupt, but to actually like force us to confront our corruption, I think this film is incredibly effective. And even if it's not successful, I appreciate that he is attempting that feat.
Yeah, I agree. And what's interesting, you mentioned fascism in 300, Aaron. Like thinking about like the legacy of this movie. Like the legacy of Fight Club is much more fascist than the legacy of Natural Born Killers. Like the legacy of Fight Club is people using the word snowflakes and like taking on like a lot of the ideas from the movie just straight.
Yeah.
Natural Born Killers is kind of dead in that way. It doesn't have a currency in the same way. It exists as this sort of like this ghost in the 90s of Oliver Stone saying, this is what I see. And in that sense, it's a really, to me, like going back and watching Stone's movie, Natural Born Killers, now was a kind of like going back in time and watching TV in 94. It felt like the same exact, like he really consciously duplicated the feeling of like flipping channels through this nightmare. And in that sense, it's like, that's why you all have a panic attack when you're watching it, because it's kind of like, Jesus Christ, like, was it really like this? These flickering images. It's a deep, heavy movie. I'm glad we had this conversation, because it made me think a lot in terms of this question that has it's still there. We're still talking about media. We still have dumb expectations. I mean,
Yeah.
fucking 1967, right? Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde with Faye Dunaway and Warren Beatty. People had the same criticisms. They were like, they made these cool characters that are violent, and people flipped out about it.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, those movies are now considered high art in some way because of their sort of ability to transcend a lot of those conversations and exist on another plane. And I don't know, maybe there will be a Natural Born Killers renaissance at some point. Hopefully it'll be as a result of us posting this podcast.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I think like the thing that's always interesting is the conversation about like, oh, the way that like movies are fetishizing, you know, rapists or murderers or whatever. And again, that like there isn't a sort of acknowledgement that like society does that like institutionally and like protects these people and fucking, you know,
a little movie called Reality, which is
Right.
which is
a little film
called Reality,
Real Life.
which is the most problematic movie of all, honestly. Yeah, no, I totally feel that. I really do. I mean, whenever people are too deep in the woods talking about how bad a movie is and how like it's like a problem in society, I'm like, I see them like with a priest costume on, they're preaching, you know, and part of me is just kind of like, there are so much bigger things we could be talking about here, and the movies to me ought to have a place that's kind of like different than what it is, but it makes sense. I mean, it's kind of exactly what Oliver Stone was saying. Our only reality is that media, so of course we're going to talk about that movie being bad or good because it's really the only thing in front of our eyes. I don't know.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly that.
I always go back to a Roger Ebert quote.
Yes. Who loved this movie, by the way, 4 stars.
He and
fucking gets
Siskel
it.
both love this movie. But he wrote a rather positive review back in the day of Dirty Harry, a movie which he said is fascist and that he hates every part of on an ideological spectrum.
Right.
But what he says at the end of this is, you know, he's decoupling the art and the statement from the like an endorsement of fascism, and says, you know, like there are people for whom this will be a problematic thing. People will like, you know, declare this movie evil or you know, dangerous, whatever. And he says, if there aren't ideologies like Harry's in this movie in the real world, then the movie's depiction of it is meaningless. It has no stake. If there are, we shouldn't blame the bearer of the bad news.
Right.
We shouldn't kill the messenger, you know? And I think that is really as eloquent a summation of like art's proximity to reality and what it can and should do, which is, does it reflect our reality back to us? Does it challenge us and make us think about it? Absolutely. I think it should do that thing. But it's also not, it's not a driver of social change, you know?
Yeah.
It doesn't do that thing.
I like that. I like the separation of the aesthetic from the content and the message, and we're not really sure of what the relationship between those two things are. I remember Orson Welles. There's a clip of him at a news conference attacking Elia Kazan because they asked him what they think of Kazan, and he's like, that guy's a fucking rat. And he ratted out his friends, and he's a piece of shit. And he made this movie called On the Waterfront, which is a total a movie that's a celebration of the informant. And he's like that. He should be ashamed of himself. But then at the end, Orson Welles says, "But he is a great filmmaker, and those are great movies." And
yes,
like, I love that. I love that. That's such an own. Like, it's such a fucking great own at the end to just be like, yeah, like it's almost like you should know better. So thank you guys. This was really fun.
This is super fun. Thank you, David.
I'm so glad that you made this happen, David. This was a really, really fantastic conversation.
Cool. Let's do some more 90s movies sometime.
Yes.
Good to see you guys. Okay, my friends, I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap today. I want to thank my guests, the Hit Factory podcast folks, Aaron and Carlee. Go check out Hit Factory. They've got so many cool 90s movies discussions going on over there. And I want to thank them especially for doing this crossover episode with us. I feel like Nostalgia Trap and Hit Factory have a lot in common. So go check out their stuff. Check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon. Take care of yourselves. And we'll talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.